Two hands of trust. Isaiah chapter 37. Hezekiah was king of Judah, and he was 13th grandson of David. The nation Israel was strong at the days of David, but later, after the death of Solomon, son of David, it was divided into two nations, northern Israel and southern Judah, and they started to decline gradually. Now, Hezekiah was the king of Judah. Northern Israel had fallen by Assyria, and southern Judah was threatened by Assyria. BC 701, Assyria invaded Judah and captured all the towns of Judah except Jerusalem. Now Assyrian king Sennacherib demanded unconditional surrender. At this moment, Hezekiah prayed and God answered. God killed 185,000 soldiers in one night. What a stunning salvation of God! Hezekiah trusted God and God saved Jerusalem as he promised. However, at the beginning, his trust was not full trust. But God gradually made him fully trust in God. Today, we learn how Hezekiah's trust developed and what is to trust fully in God. As such a threat, King Hezekiah believed in God's protection of Jerusalem, but at the same time, he sought help from Egypt. Seeking help from other nation is not bad, but the point is, God forbade seeking help from Egypt, and Deuteronomy chapter 17 and Isaiah chapter 30. Also, he took gold and silver from the Lord's temple and gave it to King Sennacherib and asked him to retreat his army from Judah. So it's like this. In one hand, he trusted in God. In the other hand, he sought his own method to escape this trouble. That's why I would say it was half trust at the beginning. At such a moment, as Hezekiah prayed to God, actually, he asked Isaiah pray for the nation. This is what Hezekiah said to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 37 verse 4. Perhaps the Lord your God will hear all these things the chief advisor has spoken on behalf of his master, the king of Assyria, who sent him to taunt the living God. When the Lord your God hears, perhaps he will punish him on the things he had said. So pray for this remnant who remains. Look here. Hezekiah called the Lord as your God, not my God or God of Israel. Also, he was not sure if God is going to save Jerusalem. God already had said that Jerusalem will be safe. But as things that were happening were contrary to what God said, one by one, all the towns of Judah had fallen into Assyrian army. That's why he might start to doubt God's words. That's why he said, perhaps. However, if Hezekiah had remembered what God had foretold about this situation, he would keep his trust in God. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 8, which is far before chapter 37, this is what God said. It will spill into Judah, flooding and engulfing as it reaches to the necks of its victims. He will spread his wings out over your entire land, O Emmanuel. Here, flood means Assyrian army. Yes, God had foretold it already. But it was not easy to trust in God as he saw the flood of Assyrian army came up to his very neck and about to swallow his head. Now, it is time for Hezekiah to decide to trust in God or just surrender to the threat of Assyrian army. Here comes God's message and confirmed he's going to save the Jerusalem. Verse 6, don't be afraid because of the things you have heard. This insult the king of Assyria's servants have heard against me. Look, I will take control of his mind. He will receive a report and return to his own land. I will cut him down with a sword in his own land. As the Lord said, Sennacherib retreated his army for a moment, but it's not total withdrawal. And he sent a letter to Hezekiah and said, hey, don't think I am returning forever. I will come back. And he said, don't let your God in whom you trust mislead you. When he says, Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Were the nations whom my predecessors destroyed, the nations of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden in Telassar, rescued by their gods? As Hezekiah received this letter, fear gripped his heart again. Why? What Sennacherib said was true. Because Hezekiah was doubting if God really wants to save the Jerusalem or not. At this moment, Hezekiah's faith was shaken once again by this letter. Assyrian army destroyed all nations. No one had escaped. Based on what had happened, it was natural to conclude that Judah will fall sooner or later. This is how many of us understand the world and estimate or guess our future. Based on what had happened, we expect what is going to happen. However, God could not be guessed by what has happened. He is not the theory of mathematics or physics. His way is unknown. His ways are beyond our thought and minds. Then you would say, then are we serving God who is totally unpredictable? Of course not. But remember, he is a person. He has own will. Of course, he is faithful to his promises and his words. That's why only through his words we can expect his next move. The return to the Hezekiah story. So Hezekiah needed to decide whether to surrender to Assyria and beg his life, or to trust in God and to seek his rescue. This time, Hezekiah prayed by himself, finally. Now, O Lord our God, rescue us from his power, so all the kingdoms of earth may know that you alone are the Lord. Rescue us for God's reputation. Look at here. As he decided to trust in God, he risked his life. If he really wanted to survive, probably surrender to Assyria is easier way. But for God's reputation, Hezekiah dared to risk his life. If he surrendered, would mean that Hezekiah agreed that God could not save Jerusalem from the Assyrian king. Then God would become like other gods of all nations. That's why Hezekiah wanted God to rescue Jerusalem. So he cared more about God's reputation than his own life. This is the nature of trust. If you risk your money or anything valuable to you, you show your trust in God. At the beginning, Hezekiah seemed to trust in God halfway, but God cut off all other hopes. And same time, God confirmed him of his salvation. And finally, God made Hezekiah trust in God fully. Now, what are the two hands of full trust? So, how to trust in God in full? Two things: God's words and taking a risk. You gotta believe in God's words and you gotta be courageous to take a risk. First, we should focus on God's words. As Hezekiah prayed to God for rescue, God answered to him very long, like long verses there. But this verse 26 is one of it. God's point is like this: I have foretold already. Certainly you must have heard. Long ago I worked it out. In ancient times I planned it. And now I bring it to pass. The plan is this: 45 cities will crash into heaps of ruins. Don't be panicked. Their conquering and their destruction of nations was God's plan. God had already spoken of Assyrian expansion and threat in chapter 10 and encouraged Israelite not to be afraid of Assyria. Verse 24. So here is what the sovereign master, the Lord who commands armies, says: My people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of Assyria, even though they beat you with a club and lift their cudgel against you as Egypt did. For very soon my fury will subside, and my anger will be directed toward their destruction of Assyria. This is spoken like 27 chapters before chapter 37, right? This is spoken to when Hezekiah's father Ahaz was the king of Judah. God meant it this way: destruction of all those nations came from God, the suffering of his people as well. And also God already promised the safety of Jerusalem. Then why do you in panic? Why are you in panic, Hezekiah? If you don't know God's words and God's plan in your life, your trust will be shaken very easily because you continuously see something unexpectedly. So it is not easy to keep your trust in God without knowing his words. God has good will for us. He always brings good things to us, but the way he brings goodness is different from our expectations. In today's passage, God rescued Jerusalem. That was good for them. But 130 years later, when Babylon invaded Judah, God asked them to surrender. It was good for them by that time. Therefore, we should focus on God's words. And number 2, we should take a risk for God. We should have courage to take a risk. If you don't risk anything, it's not trusting. Trusting is doing something which is not proven, but according to God's words. So Hezekiah risked his life for God's reputation. As you follow Jesus, you might lose money or waste time. You might lose your health or your reputation. But if you trust Jesus' goodness and follow his will, he will reward you with the crown prepared for the winners of faith. Let me close. Today, the world is full of problems, COVID-19 and environmental issues. So people in the world are screaming and they're frustrating in front of those problems. But the Bible have foretold about this, the chaos and disaster in the last days. So we gotta focus on what God wants us to do. And Jesus promised to be with us as we became his witnesses. As we become his witnesses. So we gotta stand firm in faith. So what is to trust in God fully? What are two hands of trust? Trusting is knowing God's words and being courageous to take a risk. Thank you.